Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that patients who are severely and irremediably suffering have the right to doctor-assisted suicide. The decision allows assisted suicide for physical as well as psychological suffering. Critics charge that the parameters are too broad and may expose vulnerable patients. Let's explore this topic today from a faith-based perspective. Does the Quran have anything to say on the subject? Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ally to discuss assisted suicide. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So can you define for us what is assisted suicide or euthanasia?
Euthanasia is is a term that means a good death, and assisted suicide is a way of giving a person that good death instead of allowing a person to suffer and die. Eventually, we just speed up the process by assisting the person to die, perhaps with dignity, with less pain, and earlier to escape a lifelong or a prolonged type of suffering.
Does the Quran specifically mention assisted suicide or make reference to it?
No, the Quran does, however, speak about taking your own life in the second chapter in 195th verse, where it says, "Wala tulku bi'aydikum ila tahluka." Do not throw yourself to destruction with your own hands. So basically, do not take your own life. Euthanasia, obviously, it's a modern phenomenon where people are trying to do this, and the same thing would apply. You should not try to take your own life.
What about cases where sometimes doctors we've heard of cases where if someone is on life support and there is no hope at all, and so that's why they opt for assisted suicide. What's the perspective there?
From the Islamic traditional perspective, there is a distinction, obviously, between active and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia, you deliberately try to kill the person. Passive euthanasia is where you allow the person to die. You do not go into any heroic measures to keep the person alive if you do not see that there is any need to do that. Well, Islam has already made this distinction by allowing for the cessation of treatment when there is no obvious hope that the treatment will do any good. So a patient himself or herself may refuse to even take food because they just realize that, okay, this is it, my time has come, I'm just going to die here. So that's allowed, to not take medicine because you don't feel that the medicine will do any good. So the passive euthanasia is already there in the traditional Islamic perspective.
And then what about, generally speaking, other faith groups and how they see, just generally commenting on assisted suicide?
Well, generally, life is regarded as precious in the world's religions, and to take life, this generally is proscribed. For example, we know the famous commandment, "Thou shalt not murder." So there is a proscription against taking the life of others, taking your own life. There is the sense that God is the one who has the right to give life or take life, and we hesitate to do anything that will encroach on God's domain. At the same time, the Quran speaks about the value of human life in the 5th chapter, where it says that whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved a whole people. So the idea in modern times that you can just simply end a person's life or seek ways of ending your own life because life becomes intolerable or suffering becomes unbearable, this encroaches upon this idea of giving the absolute sovereignty to God, but it also encroaches on the idea of the sanctity of life. Because once you open up this door of saying, okay, we can easily take life like this, then where do we stop? Where do you draw the line? If you talk about psychological suffering or even physical suffering, then how much suffering is too much? And if you allow for a person to end his or her life because of suffering, then where do you draw the line, especially when it comes to mental suffering? Somebody may be suffering from a broken relationship. Somebody may be suffering mental anxiety from having lost a job, for example. So do we allow for all of these persons to start taking their lives? And of course, one may say, well, these are the individual rights. They have that right, let them take their own lives. But as a society, is this what we want to have happen? And we want to set the precedent where people will start to do this more and more.
Well, I just want to pick up on that point in terms of drawing the line. So in Netherlands, a healthy woman, there's an example where a healthy woman who was deaf died by euthanasia. And then in Belgium, a child, if they get permission from their parents, they can also, opt to die through assisted suicide. So just in terms of drawing the line, any comments there in terms of what are societal implications?
Well, critics point to examples like these as examples to show that this can actually go out of control. Of course, even those who are calling for allowing this are calling for it with some controls, or they are allowing for controls to be placed, whether just to tolerate the controls or to actively seek such controls. And such controls will be necessary at every step. Even now, we need controls against abuses, and you always have abuses of laws, no matter where you draw the line and where you place a law. So they have to be controls against such things happening. But the farther out you give this allowance to say, well, yeah, you can have assisted suicide in this and that case, the more there will be some possibility of further abuses. And where this is feared the most is when we are dealing with vulnerable segments of our society. If you say, okay, a person will give the consent for his or her own life to be taken, what if you have an elder in the home and the elder is felt to be a burden to the rest of the family members, and they start putting pressure on that elder to give consent to have his or her own life taken. So these are examples of real cases where you can have many people affected in this way because of the allowance, which some people are seeking for good purposes, but we have to see the overall impact on society. So here there is a toss-up between the benefit to the individual and the harm to society on the whole.
What about just suicide in and of itself? What does the Quran say about that?
Well, the passage I mentioned earlier, which says, do not throw yourself to destruction with your own hands, this is a clear indication that suicide is not permissible in the Islamic faith. There is also a hadith attributed to our Prophet, peace be upon him, which speaks severely against the possibility of a person taking his or her own life, prescribing punishment for such a person in the life hereafter for having encroached on God's domain and taken the life of oneself. We also have in the 4th chapter of the Quran a statement, La taqtulu anfusakum, do not kill yourselves, which could mean do not kill your own people, but literally the passage could also mean do not kill yourselves. So clearly from the Quranic perspective, suicide is not permissible. What do we do then if a person is suffering? Well, we resort to palliative care, that's one thing. We as humans have to help other human beings, especially those who are suffering, and that's our responsibility to continue to care for those who are suffering and to give them as much dignity as is possible under the circumstances. We also need to have patience ourselves if we are suffering, have patience with God, knowing that God is in control and He will not give us more than we can actually bear. And in fact, God already has some natural mechanisms. For example, death eventually comes to end all suffering, and that comes from God. It's not going to be an everlasting life of suffering. In fact, when we speak about the everlasting suffering, it's in the life hereafter. And to avoid that everlasting suffering, we need to adhere to God's commandments and regulations. We need to follow His teachings so that we have, instead of suffering in the life hereafter, we have everlasting bliss with God.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.